I was working at Sydney Airport Customs when an American family walked up to my desk with 3 massive suitcases. The dad looked confused and asked me where they could exchange their dollars for real money. I smiled and said, "We use Australian dollars here." He shook his head and said, "No, I mean like pounds or euros. You know, real currency that works everywhere." His wife nodded along. I track these real stories from across Australia because they reveal something bigger. How we all see the world through our own blind spots. If you appreciate content that goes deeper than surface-level travel tales, this is your channel. I had to explain that Australia has its own currency, and it works just fine here. They looked genuinely shocked. The mom whispered to her husband, "I told you we should have brought more cash." They thought Australia used British pounds because we were part of the Commonwealth. I had to show them an Australian $20 note before they believed me. Another American tourist asked me if she needed a passport to visit Tasmania. I said yes, because Tasmania is still part of Australia, but it's an island state. She got frustrated and said, "But it's so far away on the map. That doesn't make sense." I explained it's like Hawaii for Americans. She paused and said, "Wait, so do Australians need passports to go to Tasmania?" I said no, just domestic ID. She threw her hands up and said, "See? That's exactly what I thought. So why do I need one?" I had to explain that she's not Australian. She wasn't happy about it. My co-worker told me about an American couple who arrived in Melbourne during winter, July in Australia. They packed shorts and tank tops because Australia is always hot. The husband was shivering at baggage claim and asked where he could buy a jacket. When my coworker mentioned it was winter here, the wife said, "That's impossible. We're near the equator." My coworker pulled up a map and showed them that Australia is in the southern hemisphere. Their seasons are opposite to America's. The couple stared at the map for a full minute. Then the husband said, "So Christmas is in summer here?" My coworker said yes. The wife looked horrified and said, "That's just wrong." Most people stop at laughing at moments like this. I look at what they reveal, the hidden assumptions cultures carry without realizing it. If that perspective clicks for you, subscribe now. This is the kind of lens I bring every week. I once helped an American student who wanted to drive from Sydney to Perth for a weekend trip. I asked if he knew how far that was. He said he checked Google Maps, and it's only 40 hours. I told him that's 40 hours of non-stop driving across deserts. He laughed and said, "I've done road trips in Texas. How different can it be?" I explained there are stretches with no gas stations for hundreds of kilometers. He said, "Kilometers?" I converted it to miles. He still didn't get it. I told him Perth is literally on the other side of the continent. He said, "Yeah, but Australia isn't that big." I pulled up a size comparison map. Australia is almost as big as the entire United States. His face went pale. He canceled his weekend trip. I was working as a tour guide in Cairns when an American family booked a Great Barrier Reef trip. The dad asked me how long the boat ride was to the reef. I said about 90 minutes. He frowned and said, "Can't we just drive there?" I explained it's in the ocean. He said, "I know, but isn't there a bridge or tunnel?" His teenage son pulled out his phone and showed his dad a satellite map. The reef stretches for over 2,000 kilometers in the ocean. There's no bridge. The dad looked embarrassed, but then asked, "Well, can we see it from shore?" I told him you need to snorkel or dive to really see it. He seemed disappointed. Later on the boat, he asked if the reef was man-made because it looked too organized. I didn't know how to respond to that. My friend worked at a hotel in Brisbane when an American guest called the front desk at midnight. She was panicking because she couldn't find any ice. My friend explained that Australian hotels don't usually have ice machines in the hallways. The guest said, "How am I supposed to keep my drinks cold?" My friend offered to bring ice to her room. The guest asked, "Do you charge for that?" My friend said no, it's complimentary. The guest sounded relieved but confused. She said Americans expect ice machines on every floor. My friend brought up a bucket of ice. The guest thanked her but said, This is so inconvenient. How do Australians survive without ice machines? My friend just smiled. I worked at a cafe in Melbourne's CBD when an American tourist asked for directions to the Outback. I asked which part. He said, "You know, the Red Desert with kangaroos." I explained the Outback covers most of inland Australia. It's not one specific place. He looked confused and said, "But I saw it in movies. It's like right outside the city, right?" I told him the nearest true Outback experience is hours away by car or plane. He said, "That's ridiculous. Why would they call it the Outback if it's not Outback?" I tried explaining it's a term for remote inland areas. He didn't believe me. He asked another customer who confirmed what I said. The tourist left upset, muttering about false advertising. An American exchange student at my university complained that Australian maps were wrong. I asked what she meant. She said north should always be at the top. I told her that's standard on most maps. She said, "No, I mean America should be at the top because it's in the northern hemisphere." I realized she thought maps were ranked by importance. I showed her a world map with Australia in the center. She said it looked backwards. I explained that map orientation is arbitrary. Different countries center maps on themselves. She said, "But everyone knows the real map has America in the middle." I showed her a Chinese map centered on Asia. She stared at it and said, "This is so confusing. How does anyone navigate?" I was driving a shuttle bus in the Gold Coast when an American couple asked why Australians drive on the wrong side of the road. I explained we drive on the left, which is standard in many countries. The husband said, "But that's so dangerous. Don't you guys crash all the time?" I told him our road fatality rates are actually lower than America's. He didn't believe me. His wife asked if it was hard to learn. I said Australians grow up with it, so it's normal. She said, "But what about when you visit America? Do you forget?" I explained that drivers adapt when traveling. The husband said, "I could never do that. My brain doesn't work that way." For the rest of the drive, he kept pointing out how weird everything looked from the left side. My sister worked at a bookstore in Adelaide when an American customer asked for a map of Austria. My sister showed her the travel section. The customer got frustrated and said, "No, I need Australia. I'm going to Sydney next month." My sister clarified that Australia and Austria are different countries. The customer laughed and said, "You're messing with me." My sister pulled out a globe. Austria is in Europe. Australia is down here. The customer's face went red. She said, "Well, they shouldn't have such similar names. That's confusing." My sister agreed politely. The customer then asked if kangaroos lived in Austria, too. My sister said, "No, that's only Australia." The customer bought both maps just to be safe. I worked at a rental car company in Darwin when an American asked if he needed a special license to drive in the Outback. I said a regular license is fine, but he should prepare for remote conditions. He asked what I meant. I explained some roads are unpaved and fuel stops are rare. He said, "How rare?" I told him some stretches go 300 kilometers without services. He converted that in his head and said, "So like 200 miles?" I nodded. He looked worried and asked, "What if I run out of gas?" I said, "That's why you plan ahead and carry extra fuel." He said, "That sounds dangerous. Why doesn't Australia build more gas stations?" I explained the Outback is massive and sparsely populated. He decided to stay in Darwin instead. I was working at a restaurant in Sydney when an American diner asked why we don't have free refills. I explained that's not common in Australia. He said, "But I'm still thirsty." I offered to bring another drink for the menu price. He looked shocked and said, "You're going to charge me again?" I nodded. He said, "That's insane. In America, refills are free everywhere." I told him different countries have different practices. He asked to speak to the manager. My manager explained the same thing. The American said, "This is a scam. I'm paying for water." My manager clarified he ordered a soft drink. The American paid reluctantly, but left a comment card saying, "Australian." Restaurants were unfair. My friend worked at a pharmacy in Perth when an American tourist asked where the prescription medications were displayed. My friend said they're behind the counter. The tourist said, "Can I just browse them?" My friend explained, "You need a prescription from an Australian doctor first." The tourist said, "But I have a prescription from my doctor in Florida." My friend told her that doesn't work here. She'd need to see a local GP. The tourist got upset and said, "This is ridiculous. It's the same medicine." My friend sympathized but said Australian regulations are strict. The tourist asked, "What if it's an emergency?" My friend directed her to a medical clinic nearby. The tourist left, complaining about unnecessary bureaucracy. I worked at a gym in Melbourne when an American member asked why we don't stay open 24 hours. I said we close at 10 p.m. on weekdays. He said, "That's so early. What if I want to work out at midnight?" I explained most Australian gyms have set hours. He said, "In America, gyms are open all night. This is really inconvenient." I suggested he adjust his schedule. He said, "I shouldn't have to. The gym should adjust to me." I didn't argue. He came back the next day and asked again. I gave him the same answer. He eventually complained to corporate, but nothing changed. He canceled his membership after a month. An American student in my university class asked why Australians don't celebrate Thanksgiving. I said it's an American holiday. She said, "But don't you guys want to be thankful too?" I explained we have our own holidays. She said, "Like what?" I mentioned Australia Day. She said, "That sounds boring. Thanksgiving has turkey and football." I told her Australia Day has barbecues and cricket. She wrinkled her nose and said, "Cricket is so slow." I said Americans think the same about baseball. She disagreed. Later, she asked if Australians celebrate the 4th of July. I said no, that's American Independence Day. She said, "You should still celebrate it. It's a fun holiday." I didn't know how to respond. I was working at a bottle shop in Brisbane when an American asked why the prices were so high. I explained alcohol is taxed heavily in Australia. He said, "This is highway robbery. A six-pack shouldn't cost this much." I told him it's normal here. He said, "Don't Australians complain?" I said, "We're used to it." He said, "You guys should protest. This is unfair." I shrugged. He bought the beer anyway, but kept muttering about prices. At the register, he asked if I could give him a discount for being a tourist. I said no. He said, "Worth a shot." He left, still shaking his head at the receipt. My cousin worked at a cinema in Hobart when an American family bought tickets. They brought in a huge bag of snacks from outside. My cousin told them outside food wasn't allowed. The dad said, "Why not? We bought tickets." My cousin explained it's cinema policy. The dad said, "That's a stupid rule. We paid to get in." My cousin offered to store the snacks at the counter. The mom said, "This wouldn't happen in America." My cousin stayed polite. They reluctantly handed over the bag. After the movie, they collected their snacks and left a bad review online about strict rules. My cousin showed me the review. We laughed about it. I worked at a beachside cafe in the Gold Coast when an American tourist asked why everyone was walking around barefoot. I said it's normal at the beach. He said, "But we're in a cafe. Don't you have hygiene rules?" I explained Australians are casual about footwear, especially near the coast. He said, "That's so weird. People could step on glass." I told him people are careful. He said, "In America, you'd get kicked out without shoes." I said, "Different cultures have different norms." He ordered his coffee but kept glancing at people's feet. Before leaving, he said, "I still think it's unsanitary." I just smiled. An American backpacker at my hostel in Cairns asked why Australians say "no worries" so much. I said it's a common phrase. She said, "But what if I actually have worries?" I explained it just means "you're welcome" or "it's fine." She said, "That doesn't make sense. What if something is actually a problem?" I told her it's a polite expression, not literal. She said, "Americans are more direct. We say what we mean." I said Australians do too, just differently. She said, "I'll try to use it, but it feels fake." A week later, I heard her saying, "No worries," to everyone. She'd adapted without realizing it. I was working at a hardware store in Sydney when an American DIY enthusiast asked for a 2x4. I asked if he meant 50 by 100 millimeters. He looked confused and said, "No, a 2x4. You know, the wood." I explained we use metric measurements. He said, "Can you just convert it?" I did, and he still looked lost. He said, "Why doesn't Australia use feet and inches? It's so much easier." I told him the metric system is standard in most countries. He said, "But imperial makes sense. A foot is a foot." I didn't argue. He bought the wood, but kept asking me to convert measurements throughout his visit. My friend worked at a grocery store in Melbourne when an American shopper asked where the gallons of milk were. My friend showed her the 2-liter bottles. The shopper said, "No, I need a gallon. That's what I use at home." My friend explained Australia sells milk in liters. The shopper said, "How much is that in gallons?" My friend did the math, about half a gallon. The shopper bought 4 bottles and said, "This is so complicated. Why can't everyone use the same system?" My friend said most of the world uses metric. The shopper said, "Well, they should switch to imperial." My friend didn't respond. I worked at a weather station in Adelaide when an American intern started. On his first day, he asked why the forecast showed 35 degrees. He said, "That's freezing. Why is everyone in shorts?" I realized he meant Fahrenheit. I explained Australia uses Celsius. He said, "That's going to take forever to learn." I gave him a conversion chart. He taped it to his desk. A week later, he still struggled. He'd see 22 degrees and panic, thinking it was cold. I'd remind him to check the chart. He eventually got it, but he complained about it constantly. He said, "Fahrenheit is way more intuitive." I disagreed, but he never changed his mind. An American tourist in my taxi asked why the speed limit signs showed weird numbers. I said they're in kilometers per hour. He said, "So what's that in real speed?" I said real speed is kilometers per hour in Australia. He laughed and said, "You know what I mean. Miles per hour." I did a rough conversion. He said, "Why don't you just use miles?" I explained the metric system is easier for calculations. He said, "But I grew up with miles. This is confusing." I told him most tourists adjust quickly. He said, "I've been here 3 days and I still don't get it." I suggested using his phone's GPS. He said, "But then I have to convert it in my head." I didn't have a solution for that. I was working at a doctor's office in Perth when an American patient came in. The nurse asked for his weight in kilograms. He said, "I don't know. I only know pounds." The nurse converted it for him. He then asked what his height was in meters. He only knew feet and inches. The nurse converted that too. He said, "This is so annoying. Why doesn't Australia use normal measurements?" The nurse stayed professional. Later, the doctor prescribed medication in milligrams. The patient asked, "What's that in ounces?" The doctor explained medication is always in milligrams globally. The patient said, "Everything here is metric. It's like a different planet." The doctor smiled and said, "Welcome to the rest of the world." My brother worked at a fuel station in Darwin when an American driver asked why the price was so high. My brother explained it's per liter, not per gallon. The driver said, "Oh, so it's actually cheaper?" My brother did the math. "Not really. Australian fuel is expensive." The driver said, "But the number is smaller." My brother explained you get less fuel per unit. The driver said, "This is too confusing. Can you just tell me how much for a full tank?" My brother estimated it. The driver's eyes went wide. He said, "That's insane." My brother said fuel costs vary by country. The driver filled up reluctantly and said, "I'm walking from now on." I worked at a real estate office in Brisbane when an American expat asked about apartment sizes. I said the listing showed 90 square meters. He said, "How big is that?" I said about 970 square feet. He said, "Why not just say square feet?" I explained metric is standard here. He said, "But I can't visualize meters." I suggested visiting the property. He did, and he said, Okay, it's bigger than I thought. He still preferred square feet. Every listing I sent him, he'd ask me to convert it. Eventually, I just sent both measurements. He said, "Thank you. That should be standard." I told him it's not necessary for Australians. An American exchange student in my engineering class kept using pounds and inches in her calculations. The professor asked her to convert to metric. She said, "But I'm more comfortable with imperial." The professor said, "This is an Australian university. We use metric." She struggled through the semester, constantly converting back and forth. During exams, she'd waste time on conversions and make errors. She told me it wasn't fair. I said she should have learned metric before coming. She said, "I didn't think it would matter this much." She barely passed the course. She told me metric was her biggest challenge, not the actual engineering concepts. I was working at a Sydney hotel when an American guest checked out. He handed me a comment card. He'd written, "Australia is beautiful but confusing." I read through his complaints. Metric system, left side driving, no ice machines, expensive alcohol, no tipping culture, no free refills. He'd listed everything that wasn't like America. At the bottom, he wrote, "You should really think about making things easier for tourists." I smiled and filed the card away. The truth is, these stories happen every single day. Australians working in tourism, hospitality, retail, and education all have their own collection of moments where Americans are genuinely surprised that Australia isn't just a warmer version of the United States. And to be fair, it goes both ways. Australians visiting America get confused too. But there's something particularly funny about watching someone realize the entire world doesn't operate on the same systems they grew up with. My favorite story came from a friend who worked at the Sydney Opera House. An American tourist asked her if they performed American musicals there. My friend said yes sometimes. The tourist said, "Good, because I don't understand Australian." My friend paused and said, "We speak English here." The tourist said, "Yeah, but with that accent, it's like a different language." My friend didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She gave the tourist her tickets and wished her a good show. The tourist came back after and said the performance was great, but she didn't understand some of the jokes. My friend asked which ones. The tourist said, "The ones about Australia." My friend realized the musical was set in Australia, and the cultural references went over the tourist's head. The tourist still gave it 5 stars, though. What's interesting is that most Americans who stay in Australia for more than a few weeks start to adapt. They stop asking for ice machines. They learn to convert kilometers to miles in their head. They get used to left-side driving. They even start saying, "No worries." But those first few days are always entertaining for us locals. We've learned to be patient and helpful. We explain things calmly. We show them maps. We convert measurements. We answer the same questions over and over again. Because at the end of the day, these aren't stories about Americans being clueless. They're stories about culture shock, about realizing your normal isn't everyone's normal. This is what I do here. Decode those quiet, human misunderstandings that tell us who we really are. Most channels react. I research. So if you want to see the world with sharper eyes, subscribing isn't about helping me. It's about evolving how you think, about the weird, funny, awkward moments that happen when two worlds collide. And honestly, we wouldn't have it any other way. These stories keep us laughing. They remind us that the world is bigger than we think, and they make our jobs a little more interesting. So to every American reading this who's planning a trip to Australia, just remember one thing. Bring a jacket if you're coming in July. Learn the metric system. And for the love of everything, don't ask if you need a passport to visit Tasmania. Trust me on that last one.